Okay, while the last few people trickle in, I do want to remind our participants at home or at work that we can take your questions via Slido, and we have a QR code that'll be up on the screen at some point, but if you are in the room, we've got it in the back. Oh, I'm in control of that. Let's see. Nope. It's at the end. I'm gonna go all the way. Don't look. Cover your eyes. There we go. There's our Slido, and the code is ATP 25. Okay. Looks like pretty much everybody's here. We can go ahead and get started then. Okay. Welcome back from lunch. Did anyone have a good time? Hey. All right. Me too. Such a beautiful day. We nailed it on this weather. All right. So we will also, just as a reminder, have the floating mic if you have questions at the end of this keynote session. But I'm going to go ahead and get out of the way and hand the podium over to Vice Chair Falcone.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Can you all see me? Because I know it's kind of a problem. You know, there was a U.S. Senator, Boxer, was very famous by always having a step stool where she spoke, and I kind of feel like I need that right now. But I hope that you're all nice, awake, fed, and happy. It's great to be here. I have the pleasure of introducing a favorite person of mine, our keynote speaker, my friend, my colleague, Dr. Adonia Lugo, who serves with me on the California Transportation Commission. Adonia chaired the Urban Sustainability Department at Antioch University in Los Angeles before joining UCLA's Institute for Transportation Studies in June. Since 2016, she has worked with researchers and community members to define mobility justice, an approach to transportation equity centering on marginalized communities. Adonia also co-created the Open Streets event, Ciclavia. We have one in San Diego, by the way. And the group now known as People for Mobility Justice in Los Angeles. She joined the California Transportation Commission in 2022. Please help me welcome Dr. Adonia Lugo, here today to speak on the future of active transportation and funding in California. Those are no small potatoes. I'm looking forward to this talk. Thank you.
All right, I am so excited to be here with this audience. I've been speaking at active transportation conferences for a while, but I have never spoken at one from the perspective that I have gotten to develop over the last 3 years being part of the California Transportation Commission. So I was telling our wonderful organizers earlier about how this, for me, has really felt like a community space for the last couple days, and I very much appreciate being here with all of you. So I agree, there's something awkward about this podium. Can you all still hear me well if I stand and I'm not like landing it? Okay, all right, good. I am going to talk about the future of funding and active transportation in California, starting with my view from the CTC. I'm going to go into a little bit on my research on the anthropology of streets and how I'm seeing it kind of dovetail with things I'm learning at CTC, and then I'll introduce some research I'm starting on active transportation jobs. First, I want to give a native land acknowledgement. I live and work in Tovangar, Los Angeles, which is the unceded land of the Tongva Quiche Gabrielino peoples. And we're here today on Patwin lands, and I'm using digital resources from UCLA that leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. I acknowledge my responsibility and role in reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship. And I've got an image up here of a really special place in LA called Curavugna Springs that is a sacred site for the Tongva people in West LA. So I have been on the CTC for 3 years, and I want to talk about a thread that I have been following that I first really started to learn about in December 2023 when I voted no on funding a highway project. The details of the project itself are not really that important. It was in San Bernardino. But what really came out of it for me was I got to find out who was in favor of this project and why, and who was against this project and why. And it was really instructive for getting a deeper understanding of both what the CTC can do and what we can't do, and how some of the forces at play who care deeply about how we're spending transportation resources in California aren't necessarily speaking the same language or using the same terms. So I did this no vote, honestly, kind of on a whim. I felt very compelled by the arguments that my fellow commissioner, Joe Liu, was making, and decided to oppose funding for highway expansion to find out what would happen. And what happened was I got a lot of negative feedback from people who had been in the space much longer than me, and from elected officials, from people who ran regional agencies. And you know, when anybody gets a lot of negative feedback, it doesn't necessarily feel that great, but I was not alone in that. I had a fellow commissioner, our dear chair, to walk through that with. And as I said, it was very instructive. So what I've got on these signs up here are the narratives that we were hearing around what a yes vote would mean and what a no vote would mean from very different perspectives. So on the side of people who thought we should be voting no on this kind of investment, they were saying, if you vote no, then you won't be contributing to this infrastructure system that encourages more people to drive, encourages more congestion. So, you know, what you're voting no means is you actually want people to drive less. If you vote yes, you're saying kids should be more, you know, getting more pollution around them and causing more asthma. You're saying yes to sprawl because more people are going to be relying on these highways to get to housing, and you're breaking a promise. The state has said with CAPTI and other pieces of policy that we're not going to keep investing in highways. On the other side of the room, we were hearing that we should vote yes on projects like these because they produce construction jobs. And the people who get those construction jobs are supporting their families. And this is an important area of labor and you know, what we expect infrastructure to do. And also it would contribute to those working families having easier commutes so that they wouldn't have such a tough time you know, getting around the state to get to jobs. And they said, if you vote no, this is a broken promise because your role as the CTC is to steward the projects that are coming up from the local and regional level. Your job is not to determine those projects. Your job is just to be making sure that they're on track. So it raised the question of, you know, are we just rubber stampers, right? So I'm using Streets Blog California as a public record here. I really appreciate the coverage that they do. But what we have here is an image of the CTC as being a rubber stamp on highways. And the reality is, you know, by the time a project gets to the commission level, we don't have a lot of levers for making big changes to those projects. We're not legislators, so we're not setting policy, and we're not implementing agencies, so we're not the ones who are actually bringing these projects to life. But we're not powerless either. We have a public platform, we have the dais, we can ask questions, we can offer positive reinforcement, and we can try to point out when people are talking past each other. And these might not seem like the biggest superpowers out there, but I have seen that they do allow us to use good listening and open up lines of inquiry that can lead to projects going in a different direction. So one example of where I've seen people talking past each other or having conflicting narratives from CTC is around active transportation. Active transportation, is it a special interest or is it a design standard that we should have incorporated into all of our projects? I think the answer to that is the latter, but at a commission meeting, I think in 2024, I got to grandstand a little bit about that. So this is a quote from me from that commission meeting that was put on Streets Blog California. And in it, I'm reflecting a bit about my background of work studying the bicycle advocacy movement and seeing where there were some weaknesses around who was the face of bicycle advocacy and what it seemed like people were asking for. And so what I was seeing at the CTC level was one of the results of having a more homogenous kind of movement was that the wins, such as having the active transportation program or, you know, a lot of advocacy around things like complete streets, those things were, for some people at Caltrans, associated with, okay, well, that special interest group made a lot of noise, and so they got their thing that they're asking for, but they weren't seeing it as actually the much bigger project we have in active transportation, which is creating transformative design standards for how we do transportation planning and how we invest in our streets and transportation systems. And so getting to sit on CTC and, you know, notice kind of damaging narratives like this or where we have some more narrative work to do in terms of bringing people along with active transportation, I think has been valuable. But really the biggest contradiction or way that people are talking past each other that I've observed was that same thread that I first noticed around the should we invest in highways, should we not invest in highways, which is, what is it that we're buying when we buy infrastructure? For me and for many people I know, we're located over in the top corner over there where we're thinking about, okay, we want to invest in infrastructure that's going to support multimodal transportation behavior. We see infrastructure investment as leading to how people use transportation systems down the line. We're thinking about behavior. That's our end goal. We are also talking about jobs, but we talk about job access. So how are those transportation systems going to better enable people to get to their jobs? A perspective that I was somewhat aware of because my husband is a union lawyer, but that I had not really gotten to see in person so much that I've now been very exposed to with CTC is the labor perspective, which is when we buy infrastructure, we're buying a bunch of jobs. We're paying a bunch of people to actually build that infrastructure. And so yes, we will end up with the piece of infrastructure that is going to need, you know, maintenance and repair, more jobs down the line. But the focus, the why we should make this investment, I very much hear loudly as this is about jobs. And one of the ways that we acknowledge that at the Transportation Commission is what you see in the middle here is a screenshot from our most recent agenda when we met October 16th and 17th. At the end of every agenda, you get to see laid out where we've spent money in our different funding programs and how many jobs have been created, both in that current meeting and year to date. So we're paying attention. We really do expect our transportation investments to produce jobs. And that's the perspective, you know, this is a shot here of the view that we had from the dais at our meeting in June 2024, when there were a lot of construction workers and union members who showed up to show support for some projects. So if we aren't really on the same page about what we're buying with our infrastructure dollars. It kind of, as an anthropologist, leads me to thinking about what can infrastructure actually do, right? Does infrastructure create jobs? Does infrastructure create behavior change? And it's very clear to me that the groups who I hear from as a commissioner have very different ideas about benefits to communities that they want to advance with transportation spending. The folks who are coming from the space that is more my home in terms of environmental advocacy, biking and walking, sustainable transportation advocacy, want to block further investment in highways because of the premise that more travel lanes are going to add congestion. And we see congestion as something negative because of the pollution effects, the traffic violence effects. On the other hand, people who are talking about labor and construction industries support highway investment because they're saying this is the best way to add jobs. So, you know, they're both thinking about ultimately impacts on communities, but very different kinds of impacts. And I think there are good questions to be raised about whether either of these statements is really 100% true, or maybe there's some unpacking that can be done. Is this the best way to add jobs? Well, what kind of jobs are we talking about? Is blocking highway investment the best way to reduce congestion? Well, you know, there are some people who believe really strongly in VMT formulas, but some of us have not been 100% convinced. So, thinking about what infrastructure can actually do is something that I have been obsessed with for a long time, actually. I did my PhD in anthropology at UC Irvine and was looking at what is going on in our street spaces. How do we act out our cultural and social norms as we're traveling around in our cities and spending time together in streets? And so as an anthropologist of streets, I came to the conclusion that we actually make our streets feel the way that they do. We play a role as a form of human infrastructure in how our street life goes. You have the built environment, but you also have us. And, you know, are we being nice to each other? Are we being terrible to each other? Are we terrorizing each other? Are we being, you know, kind? And what I learned over my years of research from 2008 to 2013 around bike advocacy was that the refrain that had become the norm in that movement was, if you build it, they will come. If you build bike infrastructure, people are going to use it. We only build car infrastructure, and that's why people are mostly driving. So change the infrastructure and you'll change the behavior. I don't think that's enough on its own for the major mode shift that we're actually expecting. Another thing that I've observed being on the Transportation Commission is that here in California, we're a big state, we have really big goals, and sometimes we don't put our resources where they need to be to achieve some of those goals. So we might have a bold vision for sustainable transportation in our state and expectations that people are going to be traveling differently and reducing greenhouse gas emissions that way. But we haven't actually figured out what makes people change their behavior, and we haven't invested in the scale it will actually require for millions and millions of people to relate to transportation and streets differently. So I usually summarize all that stuff, as I did in my book, Bicycle Race, that came out in 2018, as human infrastructure. So in the past, I've focused on two aspects of human infrastructure. There's the aspect of bodies moving. So literally, when you're out there navigating street spaces, the other people that you encounter are a form of infrastructure, right? Like you're not going to be able to make a turn or continue a certain way if somebody's body is there in the landscape, or somebody's body in a car is there in the landscape. And so in terms of active transportation and how we get more people moving in sustainable ways, if we want to change that human infrastructure, that expectation of how we should move in our streets, we need to give people opportunities. We need to create spaces where they can have positive bodily experiences traveling outside of cars, because so many people in our state simply don't have those opportunities. And they don't have a knowledge that they can draw on when they see, a bike lane or a transit stop. And so the reason I helped to create the LA Open Streets event Ciclavia was to help create one of those kind of catalyst spaces, like give opportunities for people to go out and feel good in street spaces, so that feeling good in a street space outside of a car over time could be something more normal in LA. So we're 15 years in on Ciclavia, and I definitely think it has created a lot of good vibes. It hasn't been the amazingly transformative phenomenon that we hoped it would be, but I think it's still a good avenue for us to be working on. So one thing I've learned now that I'm a commissioner and getting to hear so much about transportation projects is what I'm talking about as this kind of human infrastructure, changing how people move their bodies and what they feel comfortable with. Those are non-infrastructure elements, or NI. Those are the pieces of ATP projects that people are applying for that have to do with things like safe routes to school or bike rodeos, the programming, the education, the encouragement, the opportunities for people to actually, spend time with each other, learning how to relate to mobility differently. The other kind of human infrastructure that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about is around networks of people. So this is us, right? The human infrastructure of transportation in this sense is planners, policymakers, advocates, community groups, organized movements. We are the people through whom ideas flow and make their way up into policy or into programs and things like that. And so one thing that I've really witnessed at this symposium is just how many of us there are who are working at agencies or within organizations to keep normalizing multiple ways of moving as just part of our transportation systems in California. But so these are the kinds of human infrastructure that I usually talk about, the literal bodies in the street and the networks of people. And I've got a couple slides here, thanks to our fabulous active transportation program staff, to kind of illustrate how the ATP program, which is certainly not the only funding program we have that funds active transportation projects, is really the space where we're funding non-infrastructure elements. So this is some information about a project in Yuba County, and you can see that it got both ATP funding and local partnership program funding. And there's a number of non-infrastructure program elements that are listed at the bottom. Biking and walking, event days, enforcement activities, incentive programs, stuff like that. And then here's an example of a project in Ventura County that had a more modest ATP request relative to its total project cost. So this was primarily funded through Solutions for Congested Corridors, a different funding program. But you will also notice it doesn't have non-infrastructure elements. So thinking about how important those non-infrastructure or human infrastructure elements are to projects, we have very limited ways of funding them. Like, we all know how oversubscribed ATP is in general, but even within that, we don't have a lot of options for how we fund these educational or non-infrastructure components. So thinking about all this stuff, sitting up on the stage as a commissioner for a few years, hearing people talk about what it is that they think our transportation investments should do, I have learned that there is another element of human infrastructure that I had not previously spent time understanding, which is labor, which is the people who build our infrastructure. And so now I'm working to, as a researcher, see what I can bring to the conversation from that standpoint. So when we're talking about making streets safer, we have all these ways that we're focused on behavior change, changing street design, changing our standards, getting more funding. But it's kind of difficult to get a view of, well, who's actually getting paid? What are the jobs when it comes to street safety? So in November, I'm starting an SB1 sponsored project at UCLA to explore these questions. I'm partnering with the UCLA Labor Center to bring in an expert view of workforce and industry analysis and drawing on their work in the High Road Training Partnership model, which is how the state defines quality jobs. And these HRTPs already exist in public transit and in the construction industry, where they're called HRCCs. So it's a model, a labor-first model that already has been taken up in different sectors of transportation. But can we figure out a methodology for capturing the jobs that are funded by active transportation investments so that we could similarly come up with an accounting of, what jobs are going to be created as a result of our investments in active transportation? So, many of the small community-based organizations around the state who focus on transportation are doing some kind of economic development work as part of their mission, because we know that our disadvantaged communities not only have transportation equity needs, but they also have economic justice needs. So I see people all over already making the connection between their passion for active transportation and wanting to figure out how there could be more jobs or better jobs within that space. So that's part of what we'll be looking at. And so I've got some screenshots up here from the e-bike lending library down where I live in LA called South Central Power Up, that is a state-funded, not ATP funded, but a state-funded program that's intending to make a connection between how people are getting around and some training and workforce development. So one of our big starting questions, I just had my first project meeting with my collaborator from the UCLA Labor Center a couple weeks ago, and it's kind of like, we wrote a proposal, we got the funding, we know this is an important topic. Where do you start? How do you define street safety jobs? How do we imagine a space that has not typically been thought of as its own sector or industry? How do you get a handle on it? So our starting points right now are, we're using the E's from Vision Zero and Safe Systems approach to structure our data analysis. So what are the jobs in education? What are the jobs in enforcement, engineering, evaluation, and encouragement? And as we start talking to people and working our way through this, of course, we might end up making some changes, but we really just want to get to some kind of working way of being able to provide a snapshot of what kind of job effects do street safety improvements create. And then, one of the things I'm really interested in, because I have seen over the years how important human infrastructure or non-infrastructure is to the success of really bringing more people along in sustainable transportation, is what are the roles that are needed but that aren't funded, that are filled by volunteers or simply performed in unorganized ways because people just want to take care of their neighbors. And I'm interested in, if we were to try and define what makes more quality street safety jobs, could we adopt a model or a framework like what People for Mobility Justice has called their 5 Ds? And the 5 Ds, which I've got up on the screen here, is a model that we created at PMJ back in, I think, around 2017. And the Ds themselves are decolonize, decongest, decriminalize, dignify, and determination. And these 5 Ds were created in response to the 4 E's of Vision Zero. It was kind of like a playful takeoff, like, okay, you have your E's. What about, this more justice-oriented approach with a bunch of words that start with D? And so I'm interested in, with this research project, just starting to figure out, how can we talk about jobs in active transportation? What are we not paying for that actually is really transformative for our streets? And then how do we get funding for it? How do we incorporate it into the complicated state transportation funding system we currently have? So to close out, I want to just kind of leave with some recommendations that I have as a commissioner for, what I would love to see more of, which is I want to see if we can figure out how to actually include more non-infrastructure elements in other program funding, right? So that when we're maxing out ATP and we're looking at other sources to see what we can draw on, that those pieces don't have to be left by the wayside, but that they can also be funded by other programs as well. I also would love to get more invitations, and I know my fellow commissioners would as well, to have more field trips to learn about active transportation projects that you all are working on that create local jobs. If you can help us to see, the connection between that investment and that sort of economic opportunity, that would be great. And even if you're not working with a regional agency or a Caltrans district, by inviting us, you can use that as an opportunity to meet some of those folks and build relationships. That is definitely something you can use commissioners for, is to invite us out to see things. And the final piece is, we as an active transportation movement, we could be making much more ambitious requests for what we want. Because two really key things I've learned as a commissioner are jobs count, and sometimes it's easier to get a yes on $100 million than on $80,000 for reasons that I don't fully understand. The bigger asks may be taken more seriously. Politicians certainly want to show infrastructure funding coming into their districts. And we condition ourselves in the active transportation movement to think small and to keep our requests lean and to, go for the low-hanging fruit, because we're like, it all makes so much sense. This is a very reasonable request. Can we just do this, this cheap thing that'll be so transformative? And I more and more am seeing that approach doesn't get us as far as if we were just big and bold and, we're coming up with really clear ways to spend that money elsewhere, right? So it's not enough to say, don't invest in highways. We need to be saying, invest in this instead. We need to be convincing people of what those good, equally large investments are that could be flowing in, because it's much easier for a body like the CTC to say yes than to say no. And that's it. I have shared with you some of my findings and the stuff I'm still trying to figure out, and I would love to hear questions from the room and from Slido. I'll go to Slido, right? After lunch is tough. And that was a long lunch, right? So, we all got to eat a little more than we needed to. By the time I got to the hot beverage station, there was no coffee left. So I don't know how many people are feeling that same deficit, but.
I had a quick question in particular to active transit and those of us that are using multimodal. I live in Visalia. We have the worst air quality for particulate matter. And so I'm constantly making negotiations on, should I bike the whole way or should I include the bus? The bad news, TransDev is the worst administrator. So I'm so glad that you talked about labor. And so I've been all over and I talk to my bus drivers and I see them more than I see my family. It's consistent. The labor is not there. So how are we thinking about taking initiative and going to these places or to these administrators, since we're labeling enforcement at the CTC as a place of prominence?
Well, there's, I think, a few ways to answer that, but just taking one of them, wanting to get labor interested in what we're doing and actually getting labor interested in what we're doing are two different things. So I definitely think with the project I'm about to start, we are going to end up with some ideas for future action that maybe will include a sort of proposed strategy for how could we be working in alliance with labor groups more. But that is its own whole sector with its own politics, and I hope we can figure out some ways to find common cause.
Hi, I'm Claire Glogly with the City of Santa Cruz. I know everyone in this room has a ton of quality active transportation projects and not enough funding. With your invitation to come tour our projects, what's the best way to engage with commissioners to invite you out to see what we're working with and get some feedback on how to make it more attractive?
That is a great question for our staff, actually, because our staff are the people who do the coordination, and you can certainly reach out to individual commissioners, but what we'll do is direct you to staff, because they are the keepers of, keeping track of who's talking to who, and yeah, so I think Alika, Lori, any of our staff who are here in the room are a good starting point.
We have some people joining us virtually, so I'm going to ask a question. Looks like the most popular one right now is, can the CTC support getting biking and walking education into every school in California through education? So maybe how can the commission work better with public educators? Yeah.
I love that question. I think probably the starting point would be that we would request a briefing or some information from the Department of Education and figure out, I'm already like, I don't know the answer to that, I don't know the answer to that. How is that currently administered in the state? And then we would get to hear from the staff who are doing the, overseeing that kind of education. And then we could start to, we would have to have Caltrans folks in the room, and I'm sure some of these conversations have happened in the past, so we would be kind of building on whatever coordination's already there. But that is absolutely an area that we would be very interested in and can request some further information. And something I want to emphasize that, when I was appointed to the CTC in 2022, I was like, what's going on? First of all, I'm an anthropologist, and I write about mobility justice. Why am I being appointed to this state board? And, so I came in kind of wary, and I really assumed, because of my, just the stereotypes within the transportation communities I was part of, I thought I would be the only person on the CTC who was in favor of active transportation. And what I witnessed was these people are falling over each other to approve active transportation projects. The CTC is very friendly to active transportation. What we are not able to do is direct Caltrans and regional agencies to be developing these projects. I mean, we can try with, funding program guidelines to encourage those kinds of applications, but we need people at the local level to be really getting into the mix and advocating for what you want to see in projects. And that's what I'm saying around invite us out to see these projects. If you need help convincing a regional agency or a Caltrans district that what you're talking about is both legal and allowable and a good idea, we would love to show up and show our enthusiasm for those projects. So absolutely, I love the idea of us learning more about how biking and walking safety education is included in schools, and yeah, let's follow up on that.
Sounds like a great ATRC webinar topic. So it was an anonymous comment. Whoever you are, feel free to find me or Michael after the session. I'll take one more online, and then Michelle maybe in the room. How does the American with Disabilities Act, or ADA, factor into your work as a commissioner? How does it affect your decision making?
That's a great question. I think the asker probably knows the answer, which is not enough, right? Unfortunately, our disability communities are always having to just continually raise these the need for better adoption of ADA and the way that we can often talk about active transportation in a way that doesn't include both the needs and the really strong advocacy and movement work of the disability community. So not enough, that's the answer.
Hi, Adonia. Kevin Shin with California Walks. You and I have had a few conversations about some of the jobs work, and I'm curious to see if in this stage in your research you've had any epiphanies about the differences between the types of jobs for building active transportation versus the types of jobs that are being created for building highways, and whether or not they're equivalent jobs or if there's a differential between them, and that's why there is so much pushback from the unions. Any thoughts on that, or any of your research reveal anything about that yet, or is that still coming?
That's definitely still coming. I do not have, any insight yet into what the differences or similarities are between those kinds of jobs. I have been told that one of the things that makes so everybody expects our big transportation investments to have economic effects, but we're really non-specific often about what we mean by that. Like the scale of, more trucks are moving from the port to the inland port. From a state standpoint, that's a good marker of, okay, economic activity is going well. For a lot of us who are talking about our local streets, we're thinking about, is there a coffee shop that I can walk to? Is there an opportunity for young people in my neighborhood to get an after-school job or get into some sort of, workforce development program? We want to see economic effects that are right outside of our doors. And so something that's challenging about trying to, think about, can we move more of that big investment into these more local contexts? When it comes to things like local hire programs, that's somewhat at odds with how the trade unions work, because my understanding is it's kind of like you're on a list, and when you're up for a job, you're up. It doesn't matter where it is. That's another reason why for a lot of these laborers, they see a big empty highway system as an important goal, because they might have to be traveling 3 hours to get to a job site, and that's to them it's a boon to have that opportunity. But that's a really different way of structuring jobs and hiring than what a lot of us have in mind from the more local level. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to be trying to figure out. And some of you may have more insight into this, and if so, please, come and talk to me. But I have the impression from the fact that I've been, it's just kind of like my practice as a scholar and as an anthropologist is I just talk to whoever I'm next to about what I'm thinking about at the moment. So Kevin's not the only person in this room who has heard me talking about jobs in the last couple of years. But I do have the impression that this is a big gap in the research and a big gap in our advocacy understanding of where these investments go, is, what are the literal jobs that we're paying for with active transportation. And in part, it's because it's really hard to get that view, because we're talking about jobs that might be in different bureaus or departments within a city. Maybe it's functions that are split between a city and a county. So there's a reason why we haven't necessarily gotten this view. But I was just talking the other day to someone in LA who I really respect, who is just tremendously knowledgeable about our local transportation policy and funding process. And I was kind of running this by her, like, oh, I'm going to try and understand, the workforce side of things. And, I was like, are there questions that come to your mind? And she said, yeah, who builds the sidewalks? And this is someone who knows a lot about sidewalks. And I was like, you don't know who builds a sidewalk? I don't either, but it's like evidence to me of how we are so passionate about this stuff, and yet it's just an opportunity to learn something that we haven't necessarily explored yet in terms of what is the labor that goes into these projects we want to see.
So, I'm always thinking about the dynamics of how financial decisions are made, and I was thinking back to one of your slides about how you were sort of advising applicants to not be shy about submitting really big projects. So, if agencies start submitting for larger and larger projects, do you think that that would, one, have an influence on getting some of the labor trade unions on board because they might be preferring highway projects to these small projects because more bang for your buck, right? And two, like if we're programming fewer larger projects, do you think that would have any sort of an influence on the legislature to be like, okay, we've got to up this? What effect do you think that would have on the dynamics in a longer run?
I definitely think there would be an effect. So I feel like I'm in this moment, I've been thinking about how there are many strategies in advocacy, right? But two strategies that I feel like I see the most. One is, okay, we want more of this kind of project to be funded. So we need to change the policy and we need to change the funding stream so that more people will be applying for that, right? So if you increase the supply, that's going to increase the demand. Another strategy is, well, we need more people being creative about how to get the projects we want into the current funding streams, right? Like getting what we want to see funded through the structures that are out there, because I think it will apply some of that upward pressure. And we might actually see it being easier to change guidelines or add new kinds of policies if the evidence is just in front of people that this is the way things are going. And I don't want to minimize how difficult it is for people to change the way projects are done at the regional agency or DOT or Caltrans district level. I know that this room is full of really smart people who have worked in many different ways to do those kinds of changes. But from what I've seen at the CTC level, it is, like I said earlier, it's much easier for us to say yes than to say no. And so any way that we can help support the development of more of these good programs in our existing funding, we have a lot of funding. We have a lot of funding. I understand that we're in a moment of scarcity and uncertainty, but we're also California, and we have a lot of money. So yeah, so I don't know what the effects would be exactly, but I think it's an important part of the strategy that we just keep building relationships with the people who are planning these projects and, programming, what from the 5-year or 20-year plan is going to come up next, and trying to influence the shape of what they're applying for. Oh, another thing that makes me think of is that I didn't mention. We also, with this research project, we want to try and get a view of what is the active transportation industry, because I've learned a fair bit about the transportation industry as a commissioner in terms of the people who do the materials. The sand and gravel, the people who are, they have the machines that chew up the concrete and make new concrete. They're organized. They have lobbying groups. They come to the commission. They pay attention to what we're doing. I don't know if active transportation, I mean, we have our advocacy groups, certainly, but the active transportation industry, the consulting firms that do the planning and design, are you all organized? So I've been asking a few people here that question, but I'm just at the starting point. But I think that is another place that we could maybe be applying pressure from that maybe is happening in ways I don't see, but I just, what's the trade industry that Alta and Nelson and Nygaard are part of? And how come you guys aren't coming to the CTC?
We're going to take 2 more questions and then release you all for a break. We're going to start over here and then pass it over to you.
I'm Justin Huyn from Bike East Bay. I mean, I really appreciate the thought of like having more ambitious and larger applications, but also understand the burden that requires, right? You know, with less resource cities and less, you know, maybe less able to apply for those, and also kind of a smaller pot. So like, you know, like 2 questions, I guess, in a way of like, how do we support smaller cities, smaller regions who maybe can only apply for a $20,000 grant? They have no idea how to make $1 million application. And how to make the pot larger, right? If you have larger projects, there's gonna be fewer projects overall, and ATP is already oversubscribed, and we seem to fight for it every year to not die. So like, what are your ideas of like finding long-term funding streams, whether it's like redoing the gas tax or, you know, or cap and trade? Figure out how do we support like long-term sustainability of growing the pot for applications and projects?
That's a lot of questions. Okay, real quick. I don't know if you saw Lori squirming around up here when you're asking, but the ATP team does fantastic technical assistance, and they have also done an amazing job of including the Interagency Equity Advisory Committee that we get to hear from at CTC. They also are plugged in with CalSTA and Caltrans. So they have, I don't even know the half of it, but they have a very lively technical assistance ecosystem that I know they're always, you know, happy to have more people tap into. So you can just reach out directly to ATP staff. In terms of, you know, putting more burdens on that program, I totally agree. That's why I'm saying we need to be getting funding for these projects and figuring out how to fund the non-infrastructure elements from other funding programs. So CTC has a bunch of other much better resourced programs. This is a longer conversation because there's reasons, right? There's always reasons why, you know, it's harder to get things funded through those than ATP, but that's what I'm talking about, like making bigger asks that would fit more into these, fit the profile of projects in these other kinds of programs. And then the last piece about how we keep funding things, you know, I don't have a personal opinion about it, but I think that people should be more aware that the state is pretty ready to move towards some kind of road charge model. And researchers who I work with at UCLA and others who are in the UC Institute of Transportation Studies system are supporting, you know, providing analysis around that stuff. If you think that that's a good model or not a good model, now is the time to be paying attention, because it seems like it's continuing to roll forward, and we'll see what happens. But you know, it's a little bit of an obtuse position, and I get to have it because I'm the one up here with the microphone. But I know we have constraints, right? But I also feel that we need to remember, and abundance is a buzzword in California policy right now. That's another thing that, you know, we should be aware of. We have a lot of resources, and we deserve to be asking for a much bigger share of them.
Hi, I'm Iman Sylvain with Rails to Trails Conservancy, and thinking about asking for more bigger questions. I would like to know more about the framework for mobility justice, and particularly that first D of decolonize, and like whether that can include rematriating land to indigenous folks or reparation for descendants of slaves. Like how big are we talking reparation scale?
Yeah, so I skipped back in the slides to, and you're not going to be able to read this well. So just, if you go to mobilityjustice.org, that's PMJ's website. And I think it's pretty easy to find from there. This, the 5 Ds framework, it might be called Vision Incomplete. And the 5 Ds, again, are decolonize, decongest, decriminalize, dignify, and determination. And so mobility justice is this concept that I've gotten to help work on for the last 9 or so years that came from a bunch of people who felt really passionate about biking and walking, sustainable transportation, accessibility, transit, and also knew from lived experience that the strategies that were being advanced in advocacy and in planning and policy were missing something, that there just wasn't enough perspective and voice in these processes from marginalized communities, the people who've had to do, make do with less, who've had to be really creative about their mobility, about, getting around, surviving under less than ideal conditions, that actually those are the people who are going to have the best insight into what makes resilient and sustainable transportation systems. And so that's mobility justice is all about that. It's like, how can we, create more opportunities for community determination and voice within the transportation system? How can we affirm the real experiences of trauma and discrimination and violence that are part of some communities' mobility? And so it's a whole big other space. I'd be happy to chat with you more about mobility justice. But People for Mobility Justice down in Los Angeles is one of the community-based organizations that uses that model, and they do a lot of community engagement work around active transportation, working on e-bike access, and all kinds of different things. And I was lucky to be one of the co-founders of the project way back in 2008 or 9, and was on the board for a while, but now I'm not affiliated, just a well-wisher, but love their work. All right.